I've always been really interested in the unspoken nature of our experience on this planet. Even as a teenager, I often had, I guess, existential yearnings, I guess you could say, and all the reading that I would do, and back then I was a musician, all the music I would create often had very much to do with this kind of existential journey exploration that I was on. And once I got older and began making films, my films simply became an extension, again, of my explorations on this sort of existential level. It wasn't until 2007, though, when I saw a film called Into Great Silence, which is a beautiful 3.5 hour meditation on the lives of monks in the French Alps. Wasn't until then that I began to think about silence as a something other than the auditory 0 decibels notion of silence. All of a sudden, there was this silence that kind of meant much more, and it had an existential kind of implication to it, metaphysical sort of properties to it, rather than just the acoustic. And that's when I really began thinking about silence as something else. My curiosities about silence quickly became an obsession. I began to look into the works and the writings of the American composer John Cage, the works of a brilliant American avant-garde filmmaker by the name of Nathaniel Dorsky. And I stumbled across many books, one of them being In Pursuit of Silence, which we borrowed the name from, by an author, an American author, George Prochnick. And one thing led to another, and it just became it became a legitimate kind of obsession of mine. And I quickly realized that I needed to make a film about it to explore it further. From start to finish, we spent about 3 years making the film. About a year of development and initial shooting, another year of solid shooting around the world, and then it took about a year to edit the film itself and do all the post-production processes. We knew from the very beginning that we wanted to do something a little bit different with this film and not do the conventional style of documentary. From the very beginning, we would often talk about the need for this film to be both about silence and of silence, and that was very important for us, and a very important distinction, I think, that we carried with us throughout the entire process, that I think informed how we related to the film and how it developed as a film. The way that it came together was very unconventional as well. Traditionally, you collect a lot of material based on perhaps an outline that you've created for a vision that you might have in mind. And then you get into the editing room and you kind of rewrite the story, essentially. You discover the film in all the hours and hours of footage that you've collected over the years of making the film. And of course, there was a degree of that with this film, but it was important that this film, for us, evolved from a place and wasn't just something that we experienced and then pieced together later, but that it really kind of grew from an engagement, a genuine engagement with silence as filmmakers, as artists, so that it would become this kind of living, breathing piece of work, rather than, again, a sort of superficial kind of representation that was kind of pieced together after the fact. And so throughout the process, especially the year that I spent editing the film, it was imperative that I spend time in silence. I spend time engaging with the material. I went on numerous retreats. I took many breaks, actually more often than I would have typically. More breaks to just kind of take a step back and take a glance at the larger canvas, and rather than be kind of focused on the moment to moment within the film and the bits and pieces, I would often as possible, stand back and kind of take a look at the big picture. We were very conscious of the dangers of making a documentary about a subject as abstract and as mysterious as silence is. Historically and traditionally, documentaries set out to demystify something and to educate an audience about something. We knew that silence, the beauty of silence was that it was abstract. The beauty of silence is that it's mysterious. And we wanted to preserve that as much as possible, and knew that the way that we created this film and crafted this film and crafted the conversation around silence, it needed to kind of honor and respect the mysterious nature of the subject. All my films, on one level or another, are just reflections of my own explorations into a topic. And so at the outset of this film, I was very new to silence. I knew that I was curious about it. I had researched it plenty, but still knew that there was a lot more to learn about the subject. And the film essentially is an exploration of silence, my own exploration of silence. And I wanted the film to be infused with that curiosity as much as possible, and infused with that mysterious nature of silence as much as possible as well. Making this film has had significant impact on who I am and how I relate to the world around me. One quick example is that I've closed my office of 10, 11 years and have built a small room in my backyard where I now do all my work in silence and solitude. And silence has now become a day-to-day exploration of mine. One that is, I've tried to make, as much as possible anyway, fused together with my day-to-day living, with my day-to-day activities. In the monastic traditions, particularly that of the Zen tradition, you see no delineation between daily activity and an engagement with silence. And that's what I'm trying to do. Every moment and opportunity, every film that I do, every breath that I take is essentially an opportunity to engage further with silence. And that's really the ideal for me, and that's what I'm really most fascinated about, is what does life look like with a day-to-day, moment-to-moment awareness of my need for silence and my dependence on silence, and how that changes my perspective as I move out into the world, as I make my own sound, as I make my own words and offer them to the larger conversations going on around me. How does that impact the way that I then speak to the world and engage with the world? When we were about 8 to 10 months into production of the film, we had read an article online about Greg Hindy, a recent college graduate who decided, rather than go out and get a good-paying job and start working, he decided to take a cross-country walk from New Hampshire to Los Angeles over the span of 1 year and do it all in silence. And obviously we were immediately intrigued with Greg and what he was doing, and we're curious about his reasons for doing so. At that point, he was about 3/4 of the way through his walk, and we obviously had no way to get in touch with him. Greg was not carrying any communication device, no devices of any kind, and had no way to communicate. So we had scoured the internet and found a contact number for his father, an email address actually. We reached out to his father, who turns out was tracking his progress cross-country by checking in on his bank statements on his bank account to see where he would swipe his credit card and make purchases along his journey. And so every time Greg purchased a bottle of water or purchased a meal, his father would see that pop up on the bank statement and know that his son was alive and on his way, and relatively on progress. And so we spoke with the father about what we wanted to do, and he shared with us that, well, it's going to be really tricky. He told us it'd be really tricky to track him down, but we'll give it a shot. So we had scheduled, based on kind of the general direction that he was traveling in, we had scheduled some time to travel to Northern California, where we knew that he would be roughly around a specific time. So we called the father and asked, okay, where did he make his last purchase? It turned out that he bought something at a convenience store in Northern California near a city called Novato. I flew to San Francisco and drove north to Novato and went to the store where he purchased something. And I talked to the staff of the store, and they kind of pointed me in a general direction where they think he might have walked. And I just drove and drove and drove until I finally found him along a bike path it was probably about an hour and a half later that I found him, and it was a small little miracle that we found him that way, and continued to do that same kind of method to find him on subsequent trips. When I began thinking about a film about silence, naturally, as one would expect, I thought about, well, what does a film about silence sound like? What does it look like, of course, but what does it really sound like, given that I'm talking about silence here? Seems a bit of an oxymoron to introduce any sort of sound whatsoever. Because if you think about it, certainly talking isn't silent. So if I'm making a film about silence, perhaps there's no talking in the film. But then you think about the sounds of wind rustling through the leaves of a tree. That's not silent either, nor is traffic noise, of course. And so then you have what? You have a completely silent film. If you truly want to make a film that's of silence, you're talking about making a film that's stripped entirely of any kind of soundtrack. And so that, at the time, didn't quite interest me. I have aspirations of making some fun experimental films of that nature, but this wasn't the film to do that with. Because it was important for us to create a film that was an invitation for people into the subject matter. We wanted it to be accessible and have some shape and personality to it. As it's mentioned in the film a couple of times, silence is really a sound. The conversation is not about 0 decibel silence, because as we see in the film, and as we learned in our research, there is no such thing as this 0 decibels notion of silence, at least not for human beings. And so the conversation really centered around, well, what degree of sound then will give us a sense of silence? What degree of sound allows us to engage with this subject matter, this silence, if you will? I think if you had taken me aside 4 or 5 years ago and said, hey, listen, I need you to go do some silence, go to this quiet room and be quiet for a while, I think I probably wouldn't have known what to do with myself. I probably would have looked at my phone, in fact, for most of the time and just spent my time that way, uncomfortable and unaware of what I was doing. And I think that's without any context, without an accessible kind of entry point for people. I think that could be a very uncomfortable and awkward and confusing experience for many people. And again, it was important for us to create a film that was accessible on some level. It's not accessible for all people, but I think accessible for people who have a genuine interest in engaging with the subject matter or a curiosity about the subject matter. And so that gave us license, I felt, as a director, to give it shape and give it personality and give it a little bit of context to make it more accessible. A discussion about silence leads very, very quickly into a conversation about our sonic experience of the world. Our idea of silence as a philosophical concept draws its identity from the noise around it, from the sound around it, from the spoken word around it, from the music in our world. Without the counterpart to silence, it's very difficult for us to engage with a subject like silence.